Hello, everyone. It's Phil Jones, and joining me is a fired up Phil Boyle. And today we're going to be talking about HDMI 2.2. So, Phil, how are you?
I'm good. I'm fired up about HDMI, Phil. I have questions. I have lots of questions.
We get asked about HDMI a lot. In fact, I just did a version of this discussion with Gene from the Audioholics about HDMI 2.1 and things like that. But that was more from a AVR, audio side of the conversation. So today we're going to kind of talk about it from a video side, since we do talk about projectors. So Phil, you have a lot of questions about HDMI 2.1 and 2.2. Where would you like to start?
Well, I feel like we've been having this conversation ongoing since I started doing reviews for you. So let's have it on video. I tell you, I know on paper, there's a clear difference, a delineation between the HDMI 2.0 and 2.1 and 2.2 specification. But as we have discovered over the years, it turns out that a lot of the older formats can do things that are supposedly limited to the higher specs. So for example, a lot of projector manufacturers that we review, they are using HDMI 2.1. At least they're saying they're using HDMI 2.1. Yet I just reviewed a projector that's HDMI 2.0. It's the conversation we were having. And from a practical standpoint, for everything we do for video, you were saying that there's not much of a difference.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting thing, because I wanted to talk about 2.2 because they brought it out at CES, and people are going to say, okay, do I have to wait for a new projector, or when is it going to be on a receiver, and when is it going to be on a projector, and what sources are going to have it, and stuff like that. But before we get into that, we just got to talk about the basis of HDMI, right? So we know that the whole goal of these new HDMI specifications is to do a couple of things. Better video, better audio, a better gaming experience, and a better user experience, because that's the whole goal of this, right? Some of this requires more bandwidth, and some of this does not require that much more bandwidth than what we had in the past. Now, the main difference between HDMIs, if we talk about it, Phil, is how they communicate, right? If you look at an HDMI cable, if you buy an HDMI cable and that was designed for 1.4 or 2.1 or 2.2, the cable's the same. It's still the same amount of wires in that cable. It's about 19 little wires in the cable. The difference is how those wires are utilized in the different specifications, right? So if you look at HDMI 1.4, there was basically, of those 19 wires, about 4 of the wires really did the video work, right? 3 of them sent the video information, and 1 of them sent a clock information, a timing information, to make sure the information from those 3 lines were synced up properly. So that's how it was done, right? With HDMI 2.1, as well as HDMI 2.2, that old technique was called TDMS, right? This new one is called FRL. It's a new way of communicating. So now, instead of having 3 lines be the video and 1 line be a clock line, they said, we're going to use 4 lines for video, right? And those 4 lines are now all dedicated towards video. So if I have HDMI 2.1, I had 48 gigabits per channel maximum, which means each one of those lines has to pass 12 gigabits per second. Now, if you have an old cable and that cable's 6 to 9 feet long, and long as the quality of that cable is good, it could pass that 12, which is why you didn't have to go out and buy a new cable sometimes until you started getting into longer lengths, because it gets harder and harder to pass 12 gigabits per second down each of those channels. Does that make sense? So it does. It's basically a new way of communication. Well, HDMI 2.2 uses FRL as well, but now we're talking 96 gigabits per second maximum, which means each of these channels has to pass 24 gigabits per second. So that's one of the main differences between the cables. Now, now we have to also separate passing of information versus a new communication language separate from what you are communicating. So for example, you were mentioning that there's a lot of older products that have like auto low latency mode and eARC. Well, those are just instructions. It's, they are just can be communicated the old way or communicated the new way. Remember we said there's 19 wires in that cable, 4 of them are video, where the other, 15 are utilized for like CEC, audio, and stuff like that. Those cables haven't changed. So if that signal, auto low latency mode trigger, or CEC, or whatever is going down those little lines, I can use the old format to do that.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So that's why you go, well, Phil, this thing says 2.1, but it doesn't support, 8K, and it doesn't have all of the different features. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just utilizing the new communication. It speaks Italian. It can speak Italian, right? As well as English, Mm-hmm. And but it doesn't mean that just because I can speak Italian, I'm going to tell you more. I just have the capability of telling you more.
But effectively, for the basic use that somebody with a projector who's buying a 4K projector, right? Not an 8K projector, HDMI 2.0 is going to pretty much do, unless they're doing like some super advanced gaming things, it's going to do everything they needed to do.
Exactly.
So they should be okay.
Exactly. And that's one of the things, like 2.1 is probably going to be the way that projectors are going to be utilized for a while. If you look at HDMI, there's basically certain things that make the file size bigger, right? You have your resolution, your frame, how many dots are in each frame, right? Then you have your frames. How many frames per second am I going to show you? Then you have your color depth. How many shades of color am I going to put into that signal? And then you have brightness range and color space. These are the 5 things that make up video, right? But of these 5 things, only 3 of them make a file bigger. So Dolby Vision files are not bigger than HDR10 files. They're not. Okay. They're not bigger, that much bigger than a 4K 60 frame per second non-HDR file. The only reason why it may be bigger is the SDR may be an 8-bit and the HDR may be in 10-bit or 12-bit. But a 4K 24 frame per second 10-bit SDR file size is about the same as a 4K 10-bit Dolby Vision file, because the things, it's not the brightness range or the contrast curve that makes it bigger. It's these things. So if you think about it, projectors are 4K. Eventually, you may see some 8K pixel shifting DLP and other solutions, but the fact is the signal is mostly 4K. All right. When it comes to color depth, most displays are 10-bit, right? You could feed it more, but most displays are 10-bit. So that's not where the growth is going to come. So most of the time, you're going to see most of the growth is going to come from the higher frame rate, is where people, the higher frame rate. But for us, we don't really need it. If you look at this chart, this shows you all the things you can do with 2.1. And we're not even touching it's kind of small for you to see right now, but we're not even touching the full capabilities. So uncompressed, you could easily do 4K 120, 8K 60 with what's called lossless compression. You could do 10K at 120 frames per second. Okay. And before you even get into HDMI 2.2.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to ask you about, I think would be an interesting topic, was another thing we were talking about, which was what it takes to label your projector HDMI 2.1 compliant versus 2.0.
The main thing that it takes to label your cable, your product HDMI 2.2, is you have to be communicating using the HDMI 2.2 standard, right? For example, like we talked about HDMI 2.1, you get the little logos on the boxes and stuff like that. That was, hey, HDMI 2.1, we communicate FRL. I can communicate FRL. Okay, well, if you can communicate FRL, then your HDMI input's a 2.1. Doesn't mean that you're going to use all the features that or provide all the answers you can communicate. You're just using the new communication format. So, so that means I can do more bandwidth, like we talked about, or I can do more features, right? So we talk about HDMI 2.1 has a bunch of features. So I can say, now I have this new communication platform, and I'm choosing to communicate and do things like, variable refresh rate, or quick frame transport, or low latency mode, or quick media switching, or enhanced audio return channel, or eARC, or what I'm going to give you, I'm going to use more bandwidth and give you more information for 4K 120. I don't have to do all of them. I just have to communicate using FRL to be labeled HDMI 2.1. And then once I'm communicating that way, I can add or subtract these other features. So that's why
you may not. Sorry, I was just saying you may not know the answer to this. I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that a relatively new thing, or has it been that way since the standards were established?
Well,
did they kind of lax the standards a little bit toward the end so that more people are able to say HDMI 2.1?
I think what they said was this: we're getting ready to change how our devices communicate. And we have this there's a big HDMI consortium. There's hundreds and hundreds of companies that make video displays, sources, cables. They all have to be on the same page, right? Yeah. And they said, okay, 1.4 wasn't enough data to do the things we need to do for future displays. So we all have to start talking Italian, right? So let's get everybody talking Italian. And then once we start talking Italian, then the source device that has a capability can talk to a display device that has a capability, if they so choose to talk about something like maybe enhanced, maybe like quick media switching, We all have to talk Italian. That's the first thing. Let's get everybody talking the same language. So,
Molto bene.
Yeah. And then once we're all talking the same language, the FRL language, then it's HDMI 2.1, right? If you look at now, by the way, all devices that can communicate in Italian can also communicate in English. So all the ones that are 2.1 can also communicate the old way as well for legacy devices. So if I take a brand new, say I take a high-end gaming system that can communicate in FRL for 4K at 120 frames per second to communicate with a brand new, 4K 120 projector. Like I just did the new Sony Bravia Projector 9 that will accept that has HDMI 2.1 connections, and it can communicate. It can accept 4K 120 game signals, right?
Right.
But at the same time, if I plug that into an older Sony projector, that still like a 5-year-old Sony projector, the Xbox will just communicate using the older language, which is HDMI 1.4. So it's backwards compatible. It's just, can you communicate the new way so you can take advantage of the new features?
So we spent a lot of time, you and I, talking about how we don't, for the most part, we don't really, I'm not saying we don't need HDMI 2.1, but we're not utilizing all of the aspects of the standard, right, for what we do. Yet, here comes HDMI 2.2. We're not even maximizing 2.1. We're not even close to maximizing 2.1 completely. Yet, new standard.
Why double it? Right? Because, like, for example, nothing right out there right now. Most of the video display, most of the AVRs only use 40 gigabits per second. Most of the sources only output 40 gigabits per second. The information that can be provided, if you look at this chart, is insane. Well beyond the capabilities of most of the TVs. So you go, well, why would I do this? Well, remember, Phil, the main thing we're trying to do here is if I have an AVR or I have a TV I have to choose as a manufacturer, what type of plug am I going to put in the back, right? And I want to make sure that when I pick that plug, I have everything sorted, right? But when you look, HDMI is not the only guy on the block, right? And if you go out and buy a super high-end gaming monitor or a lot of professional displays, they use DisplayPort. And DisplayPort has introduced a new one called DisplayPort 2.1. This can support 80 gigabits per second, right? And now you're looking as an AV manufacturer. Say you're an AV manufacturer that makes AVRs. You're like, I don't have room to put 8 HDMIs and 8 display ports on here, right? So which one am I going to do, right? The TV manufacturer says, I don't have enough to put 4 display ports and 4 HDMIs. So the best way for HDMI to make sure that, hey, we could do it too, don't worry about it, still use that HDMI cable, is to say, you know what, they do 80, we'll do 96. Don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about swapping out and abandoning HDMI just to be future ready. So that's why they did it. So the introduction of other connections has motivated the HDMI Association, the manufacturers, the cable companies, everybody involved to evolve HDMI so we could stick with that technology. So that's why it came out. Doesn't mean you're going to use it now. It's just one of those, like we talk about, buy once, cry once. Don't worry, it's going to work. Just continue to use those plugs on the back, you know, and it's going to be ready for you. It's going to have all the data you're ever going to need. Don't worry about it. When you do make your 10K TV, you can still use it. You ain't going to buy a new HDMI board. The HDMI is just waiting for you to advance your systems. So that's why they actually did it, because the bandwidth is gigantic, you know. So you probably aren't going to
Phil,
use it.
What you're saying is it's future proof.
It's trying to future proof. Now, the other thing too, we mentioned that while we call it HDMI 2.1 and 2.2, they're constantly, I'm sure, doing updates to fix things because no format is perfect. So the goal is to build a really, really, really good format and then just fine tune it along the way. Let's fix some of the things like audio lip sync issues and stuff like that, right? Because the capability of this cable now is stupid. I mean, 16K, you know, uncompressed video signals. Now, I don't see someone having a 16K TV in their house anytime soon, but there will be applications where these crazy formats are available, like 12K at 60 frames per second, or 8K at 240, or 8K at 440 frames per second. And that could be things that will come in the future. Right now, nothing, right? It's just for the future.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And I think what I'm hearing here is that these standards, they are a work in progress. You know, what they establish a specific standard to be, technology improves, compression technology improves, processing improves, and suddenly hardware that maybe when it was first established, you know, wasn't capable of doing a specific feature now can. And so these standards they're evolving,
Exactly,
and they're, you know, and not exactly at the pace of there's a new number, so now there are these new features. No, these new features tend to be dropped in periodically. Exactly. And it's a combination of that and sort of keeping up with the Joneses too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Number one, show that it's still one of the most advanced connection capabilities. Number one. Number two, let's stay way ahead of the display manufacturers and the source manufacturers. So the source manufacturers can just enhance the capabilities of their display and know that the connection is not going to be a bottleneck, right? So imagine if we hadn't made HDMI and we were still on composite video. And all of a sudden, bang, I have the capability of doing an 8K TV. And it's like, well, how the heck do we get the data there? You know?
Right.
So and then how do we make sure that it's copyright protected and all the other things that we have to do in order to get the studio to give me that content at that resolution. So let's solve all that way ahead of time. So in case what comes, you're going to be prepared. Because right now there's no sources. You know, if you're a movie person, when it comes to these higher resolutions and this higher bandwidth, meh. I mean, it exceeds the capabilities of your TV. There's no sources. There's no streaming services. There's no physical media that's going to be doing. You're not going to find a new movie that's coming out in 4K at 480 frames per second. You're not going to find a new movie coming out at 8K at 120 frames per second. However, if you're a gaming person, if you think about being a gamer, there's some monster gaming cards that are being popping up that can support 1440 and 4K at ridiculous frame rates. So hardcore gamers, guess what? This is where to go. Interesting thing, Phil, is a lot of times the projectors are ahead. Like I said, I have this 4K 120 Sony sitting here. You're starting to see 240 and much higher frame rates on gaming projectors from companies like BenQ and stuff like that. So it seems to be the frame rate that is leading the charge for hardcore gamers, because lower frame rates also mean lower refresh rates. So this is what's really driving it. These big computers.
So when does the DisplayPort Consortium throw in the towel and go away and surrender to HDMI?
They're going to be DisplayPort 2.3. Because this was interesting, Phil. When I went to the LG booth, right, and they were showing off some new computer monitors. I mean, some new gaming monitors, right? And I was there with a bunch of the gaming guys who do all the gaming and computer stuff, and all of them said they don't even use HDMI. They're all DisplayPort and USB-C. Right. That's their thing, right? Entry-level computer, simplest one, USB-C. Hardcore, massive data transfer between a graphics card and a display at massive resolutions and ultra-high frame rate currently is DisplayPort. So if you look at this guy, this LG could do, what was it at? Full 4K at 240 frames per second and HD at 480 frames per second with a response time of 0.03 milliseconds. That's ridiculous, right?
That's a seizure waiting to happen.
Yeah, but if you look at it, it's DisplayPort 2.1, right?
Sure.
That's how you get there. So HDMI wants to be, there's an HDMI cable back there, but they realize that those hardcore graphics cards, we need to get that HDMI on the back of that graphics card, that NVIDIA graphics card, as well to be able to do the same thing as that DisplayPort, or they're going to start removing it, and it's going to go the way of VGA, and that's not what they're looking for.
So let me ask you. So I understand now how we got to 2.2. And the combination of things. And I know that it's more than just, displays like projectors and televisions that utilize HDMI. There are plenty of other devices that alone could drive the advancement of the specification. But is there anything specifically related to us in current projector technology, let's say the next year or two, that's going to really be able to leverage 2.2?
Okay. Well, the thing is, there's with the exception of bandwidth for 2.2, maybe they're going to do some improvements to some of the things that you already find in 2.1. The one that I'm wishing they're going to hurry up and fix is quick media switching. So if you're a projector person and you've noticed that when you switch from SDR to HDR, the screen goes blank forever before the image comes up, that is because when you switch from one format to another, the HDMI, the old HDMI standard required a new for you to recommunicate and reestablish that you have rights to use it. So when you went from HD 24 to HD 60 or 4K 24 SDR to 4K 24 HDR, each time you had to verify rights, which is why the screen went blank forever. So this is supposed to solve that. But the new one is that they're working on is called Latency Indication Protocol, LIP. So this is designed to fix lip sync errors. So what they've noticed is there is a part of HDMI 2.1, which is like an auto lip sync correction, and it does do a little bit better, where basically the source device and the display device will communicate with each other, and if there's something in between, like an AVR, they can communicate through the AVR to make sure that the voice and the audio comes together. But as systems get more elaborate, there's starting to be issues. So what they're working on is this new communication to try to fit the lip sync error. So as a projector person, this is probably the only feature that you're really going to need on a home theater projector anytime soon.
And I've actually seen little indications of that recently. I'm not going to name names or brands or anything, but you and I have talked about in the past where, some projectors that I review, whenever you plug in an external HDMI streaming device, there are sync issues, just a little bit. I don't think most people would notice it, but when the projector's internal operating system and built-in apps is like really good sync, and you plug it, you notice just a few milliseconds, microseconds off. So that'd be nice. And again, a name brand projector I was recently reviewing, when I launched Apple TV, I got audio, I got no screen. I had to completely reboot the projector to get it to reconnect and resync. And there wasn't even any multiple devices in between. The external device was connected directly into the projector. So it'd be nice to have some of those things be less prevalent.
Yeah, because you think about it, if you have say I have a kaleidoscope. The kaleidoscope is connected to a beautiful Denon or Marantz AVR, right? That kaleidoscope has to send the video to the AVR. The AVR has to extract the audio from that signal, make it all multi-channel, spit it around the room, feed the signal to the JVC projector. The JVC projector has pixel shifting to take the 4K and pixel shift it up to 8K, and it all has hit the screen at the exact same time. So the voice coming out of the center channel matches the 8K upscaled video.
Right.
So there's video processing going on in the TV. There's audio processing going on, and delays and multi-channel and going on in the AVR, and it all has to happen and all arrive at the same time. So if someone snaps their fingers, the finger snap you see on screen aligns with the snap you hear. So it can be a little complex. So they're working on that. Now, if you look at it, like I mentioned, Phil, here, 4 of these lines are video, right?
Right.
That kind of signal does not go through the video line. If you look there, there's ones for CEC, control. Your audio lines are there.
Right.
Your timing lines are there. So it does not mean that they can't take this lip function and say, you know what, it runs down line cable or line 7, the line number 7 or line number 12.
Right.
Why don't we just, and it's the same line in 2.1 as it is in 2.2. Why don't we just run that data down that line and add it to a 2.1 source? You know what I mean? So it doesn't mean that even that new lip sync issue is only going to be exclusive to 2.2. It may be available on a 2.1 or possibly a 1.4 piece of HDMI. Sure. It just depends on what line or what wire in this HDMI cable is that data going down.
There are a lot of little things they could address. Like, I can't tell you how many times I just had it happen today on a projector I was evaluating where I was using eARC. I was using an eARC device, feeding my sources into it, and then running that eARC connection back to the projector. And everything worked great until it came time for CEC control to shut the projector off. CEC worked great for controlling, but when I shut down my source device, which was plugged into the receiver, it didn't pass the power down signal back onto the projector. So then I had to go in and manually shut the projector down. It's little tiny things like that that you'd hope that they would address. So. Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is one of the things they did last year with 2.1 is they separated the two. Before, if you wanted ARC, you had to have CEC on. So now they separated that signal. So you can have ARC and CEC or ARC or C. You don't have to have them both together. So it all depends on the customer's capabilities. Now, when it comes to, as we mentioned, the cables, Phil, are going to be the same wires in the cables are going to be utilized for both 2.1 and 2.2. The difference is those video lines, those 4 video lines, instead of having to carry 12 gigabits per second, they have to carry 24 gigabits per second, right? So if you have a very, very, very good, say 3 meter HDMI 2.1 cable, it's probably going to still work for 2.2. It's just as the cables get longer and longer and longer, it's going to be more and more difficult. If it's a shorter cable, most likely you're going from your PlayStation to your Xbox and they do a 2.2 and it's 3 meters. It's a good chance you won't have to replace it. But as it gets longer. Now, the thing is, like this, for example, this was a prototype cable they showed at CES when I was there. Everybody were passing it around in the room. We were taking photographs of it. So this is a Rocketfish 12-footer, right, that they were actually showing. Now, we always joke that the quickest way to get someone to buy something is to put a bigger number on it. Oh, it's not. Sure. It's not 2K, it's 4K. It's not 4K, it's 8K. It's not 8K, it's 16K. So the nice thing about it, if you buy this crazy 16, then probably the 8K cables are going to go away, or they're going to be like, would you like to supersize it? So think of it this way. Right. You know, 4K would be like your large, right? 8K is your big gulp, and then 16K is your super big gulp, right? You don't need it all, but hey, it's kind of nice if I don't need it all, but I still can have the big one. Let me get the big one. So you could buy this cable now and have it work its way when it comes out, but don't feel like you have to buy this cable right away, and unless you're going to run something in a wall like 30 or 40 feet. Sure. You know, I would buy the highest bandwidth cable I possibly can today, because it costs a lot more to go back into the wall and change it than it does for the cost of the difference in the cables. So, I'm seeing a whole bunch of "this is Spinal Tap. It goes to 11" memes. It goes to 11 when it comes to this stuff. Yeah, exactly. So it goes to 16. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you've got to drive the business. You've got to. Hey, accessories are profitable. And you're right. People want the big number, but it doesn't say 16. Well, you don't need 16. But it doesn't say 16. Exactly. So, yeah. Now makes sense. Now for television people, a lot of the cables we're talking about, they'll be fine, because most of the time, in most situations, the TV is right here, and right below it is a cabinet that has a sound bar and maybe a Blu-ray player. So cable links, we're talking, you know, 10 feet, 12 feet. So these types of copper-based cables are going to be perfectly fine for a lot of the consumers, right? But we know with projectors, the projector is way back there, way over there, and all the stuff you connect to the projector is way over here. That's right. So now we're talking 20, 30, 40, 50-foot cables, and that's where it gets to be a problem. So as you add bandwidth, it gets harder and harder to do. Interesting thing, Phil, is people always ask about active cables. How do they work, right? So if you have an active, the way an HDMI cable works is as they get longer and longer and longer, more noise gets added. They start to pick up noise in the signal. And it gets to the point where it's so much noise in the signal that the cable, the source has no idea what you're trying to say. It's almost like if we're speaking Italian and it starts to get static, and eventually gets to the point where the static makes it so stand that you can't, I don't know what you're talking about, and the display goes blank, right? So most active copper cables, what they have on the active the cable, the side that plugs into the display, that's normally this part that's powered. It is a noise reduction circuit. So what it does is it just cleans the signal, and because I can clean the signal enough, the display can understand it. Maybe clean and amplify. That's what that does. When you have an optical cable, what the optical cable does is it turns the electrical signal into blinking light on one side, and then when it gets to the other side, it takes the blinking light and turns it back to electrical signals. So what an active copper cable does is completely different than what an active optical cable does. But but a lot of times I see after about 12 to 15 feet, there's not going to be a lot of copper-based HDMI 2.2 cables. They're just not going to happen. But you need to look for the little logo that's on the box that says Ultra on it, Ultra 96, and you'll know it's going to pass the bandwidth. If it doesn't have that logo on it, there's no guarantee. All right?
It's always one of the nice things about HDMI cables, though, in general, is that either they work or they don't. There's none of that. The day of customers calling, going, I've got static in my image, and
Exactly.
It's like because they're using composite cables or component cables or S video cables or God knows what else. It's either works or it doesn't. So there's a certain amount of comfort in that.
Exactly. And I've been telling people, if you're a projector person and you're planning on mounting a projector in the back of the room, always use an optical solution, right? Even if you're going to run a regular standard copper HDMI or run AP or use Cat 5 or Cat 6, pull a piece of fiber, right? Just one little piece of fiber. It used to be expensive. Now we're talking, if I'm already in the wall and I'm pulling the wire, the difference between just running one wire and running the wire that I'm going to use today and a piece of copper is probably going to increase your price by about 20%. But guess what? You don't have to ever worry about it. So we're just talking about 96 gigabits per second, right? If you look at this multi-strand, each one of those lines can support 100, right? So right there, there's 6 lines on that cable that can support up to 600 gigabits per second, right? So guess what? You pull this wire, you never have to worry about going back into that wall and replacing that wire. So you just pull the wire and then you'll just terminate it and then put these extenders on. Like this is an older version of an extender using copper that was doing 18 gigabits, but there's extenders now that can do 40, no problem, right? Okay. So the nice thing is that wire is going to stay the same. You're just going to change the boxes at the end, right? When you buy a cable like this, all this cable is, Phil, is those big boxes that are here? They've just been miniaturized to go into the tips of those cables, right?
So it's a chip.
It's a chip. Instead of a box, it's a chip. Now, the cool thing about this kind of cable, I like these bullet train cables and this companies like Clearline. The wire in that cable is the same as that multi-strand. So in the future, if those tips and chips in those tips aren't good enough, you could literally cut the ends off this cable and re-terminate it and plug it into an extender system. But worst comes to worst, put one of those in. If you're really cheap, so at least you can get to it, right? So conduit is your friend. So if you don't want to spend the money on the funny thing is by the time you ran the conduit, it probably costs you more than the optical cable itself.
I have a stack of that kind of conduit sitting under my front deck right now, just for the purpose of running cables from the main house to the guest house
Exactly. So we've always said bigger is not always better. So yes, we have this 96 gigabits per second capability, 2.1, but you really don't need that, right? Most of the signal that we're using today can easily be done using way less bandwidth. So for example, 4K uncompressed 24p movie content. I'm a movie guy, Phil. Right. Are you a movie guy? You're a movie guy.
Of course.
Right? So we're movie people on the baddest of the bad. Like that's a Bravia 9, $31,000 projector, right? If I'm watching a movie, I am using the best movie, Dolby Vision, whatever you want. The maximum I'm going to use at 4K 24p 12-bit, which the projector can't even utilize the full 12-bit of color, is 13.37 gigabits. That's it, right? So all this other stuff is great and dandy, but it's absolute overkill. And as we mentioned, the displays are only 10-bit. So yeah, you can go in there and make it 444 and 4 and 12-bit, but you're just telling an old Fiat in Italian to go 500 miles an hour. Thank you. I understand what you want me to do. Can't do it.
But not going to do it. Yeah.
Can't do it. Right. So I want to be able to communicate all the data that my display needs to know in order to do what it can do at its full potential, right?
Got it.
So bit depth is really important. That matters more than that 444. Everybody looks at 444 and 422. Don't go into your Apple TV and change everything to 444. All you're doing is making the file size bigger. You're not making the picture better. You should be more concerned with bit depth. How many shades of color is what you get from bit depth? 12-bit, 8-bit to 10-bit goes from what, 16 million colors to what, a billion colors? A billion, colors. So that's more important. So
that's good advice too. I got to wonder how many people will go into their devices that give you access to that and change it from 422 to 444.
Exactly.
No idea that they're crippling. They're hurting their system.
It must be better, right? So I have this big Panasonic here, this big Panasonic Blu-ray player, and you can go in there and crank everything up. Oh, I want 444, and I want this, I want that, I want this, right? All you're doing is making the file bigger, which makes it harder for your HDMI to run it from point A to point B, especially on a projector. Because we're not talking 6-foot cables, we're talking 16, 20-foot cables, 30-foot, 40-foot cables. You're making the data harder to bigger, right? So it's almost the analogy I always use, Phil, is imagine you go out and you buy your loved one a beautiful diamond ring, right? Mm-hmm. And I put it in a shipping container. It doesn't make the diamond ring any nicer. It doesn't make it glitter anymore. All you're doing is making it harder to ship that diamond ring from one point to the other. And you going in and turning analogy. Everything up to 12-bit and 444 and everything else, all you're doing is making it harder to move the data from one spot to another, and you're not making the experience any better. Basically, unless you're a hardcore gamer, and you want to make sure that you are ready to be at the bleeding edge of gaming. Like when they come out with the PlayStation 6 and the Xbox Mega and the Nvidia Quadro 9 million GTX, and that's the person that this is actually for more than anything. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we just wanted to go through that conversation to make sure that people truly understand what the heck is going on. And
let's be honest, those gamers that you're describing, they're using dedicated gaming monitors because they're taking it so seriously that they need the other advantages that these hyper fast, high performance, very expensive gaming displays provide them.
Exactly.
Right.
But
they're not going to be pro gaming on the latest Hisense projector.
If you're playing Halo on your Sony, Bravia or your BenQ X, 3100 or your new, Valerian Vision Master Max versus some dude who's playing an opponent that's playing on their Samsung flat panel, you're going to be competitive right now, right? If you're playing, and normally you're not going to be sitting there on your couch using your Vision Master versus some dude with a, you have an Xbox and a Sony projector. This dude's got a giant gaming tower, a Zowie monitor, and he's right up here like this with like custom controllers and custom. No, not the same guy. He's you're bringing a water gun to a gunfight. Okay, so it's a whole nother level of person. But the people you're going
to bring a toothpick to a gunfight. I mean,
a toothpick to a gunfight. Exactly. So, but if you're a casual gamer, I guarantee you, gaming. I was playing Halo on that big Sony. I have to give back tomorrow. It's shocking how cool that is on a 165. I took it to the office and put on a 165-inch 235 screen. Halo on a screen like that with a $250,000 sound system is a little better than you sitting around on your couch playing it on your 65-inch TV.
Sure. And it's still, I mean, it'd be nice to think that next year, some projector manufacturer, I won't name names because I'm just making this up, is going to come out with a gaming projector that's actually competitively spec'd to, you know, a gaming display.
I will say that, you know, DOP we mentioned during our conversation about after CES, that they have a new DMD controller. So the mirrors weren't the level. The speed of the mirror wasn't the problem. It was the control that told the mirrors what to do. And the new controller, they say, can support, you know, well over 400 and, you know, 1440 or 4K or HD at like 960 frames per second, some insane speeds, right? So you're going to start seeing that. But like I said, the nice thing about it is if they do decide, BenQ or a big DLP manufacturer decides to put that chip with that controller into the mega gaming projector, guess what? Because of HDMI 2.1 and because of HDMI 2.2, they don't have to worry about the cable, the HDMI being the limiting factor of you getting all of that capability.
Ooh.
But
so I do have something to look forward to.
Yes, yeah, and I'm not sure. Like I saw them playing games at 480 frames per second on an HD, and it looks insane. It's so smooth.
Okay.
Now a movie guy would hate it. It doesn't like a movie at all. People.
Sure.
It just looks, you know. But if you're playing space aliens, you know, and shooting weapons at each other, that's where it actually comes in. So hopefully, Phil.
It's all back to Peter Jackson when he actually shot The Hobbit in 48 frames per second and released it to a specific number of features, and people were like, "What is this? No."
Exactly. So hopefully today we've covered it and helped you guys get a better understanding of out there about what HDMI is. So 1.4,
I know I got a better understanding.
Yeah, 1.4 used an old language. So when we got to an old way of communicating on the HDMI line, so that meant all the way up to 4K at about 30 frames per second. When you get to 4K 60 and HDR and everything else, it went all the way up to 4K at 60 frames per second. If you want to go exceed 4K at 60 frames per second, 4K 120, 8K 60, it required a new way of using the wires in the cable to communicate. The new format, HDMI 2.2, still uses the same communication platform as the HDMI 2.1, still uses the same wires in the cable. They're just shoving more video data down each one of the lines that they were using in that cable. So still speaking the language, just speaking it a lot faster with a thicker vocabulary. So for you projector people out there, you're cool with HDMI 2.1 for a while. You know, 2.2 is just going to be a bonus.
We should have just started the video with that.
To summarize, do you need it? Not for a while. That's the best way I can explain it. If you're not a gamer, not for a while, right? Because even 4K at 4K at 480 or HD at 480 could be done with HDMI 2.1 right now. So,
but we genuinely appreciate all of you staying to the end of the video to get that. That's important.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys got some information out of this thing, because I had this whole conversation about from the audio side. I really want to have a conversation about from the video side, and I realized that on Projector Reviews, you and I, Phil, not had that conversation. So if you guys have any more topics you want to talk about, make sure you toss them in the chat. If you like these types of videos, please make sure that you like and subscribe, people, and tell your friends to come hang out. Also, we don't charge for any reviews, and we always appreciate that if you look at a review or an article or a video and you decide that you want to purchase one of the items that we've talked about, please utilize the affiliate links below, because we get a small commission at no cost to you, which helps us continue to develop and create this great new content. So with that, Phil, thank you for talking to me today.
You're welcome.
Hopefully you've learned something, and we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Always learn something when I talk to you, Phil. Always. Take care.